I never thought I'd have to go to war with a homeowners association, but here I was, standing outside my elderly mother's house, staring at a thick, rusted chain padlocked around her front door. My blood boiled. I banged on the door. "Mom, Mom, are you in there?" Her frail voice came from inside. "Zane, oh, thank goodness you're here. I can't open the door." I clenched my fists, turning to the smug woman standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, lips pursed in satisfaction. Karren Sterling, president of the Oakridge HOA and self-appointed neighborhood dictator. She was the kind of woman who thrived on making other people's lives miserable, and today she'd gone too far. "She didn't pay her late fees," Karren said, shrugging like she had just informed me of the weather. "Rules are rules." I stepped toward her, my voice dangerously low. "You chained an 80-year-old woman inside her own home over a stupid HOA fee." "She had warnings," Karren replied, tapping her clipboard. 3 months late, we have protocols for delinquency." I gritted my teeth. This isn't a delinquent account. It's my mother, and you're going to unlock this door before I make sure you regret this. Karren scoffed. "Oh, please, you can't intimidate me. We have bylaws. The HOA has every right to enforce penalties when necessary." I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture of the chain. "You just committed unlawful imprisonment, Karren. You're going to open that lock, or I'll have the police do it for you." Her face twitched just the slightest bit. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth, "but your mother still owes the fees, plus a new fine for noncompliance." I wanted to laugh at the sheer audacity. Noncompliance? You mean for not willingly being imprisoned in her own house? Karren ignored the sarcasm, fishing out a key from her purse. She made a big show of unlocking the padlock, as if she was doing me some grand favor. The second the door was free, I pushed it open, rushing inside. My mom, Kathleen, stood in the living room, looking shaken but trying to compose herself. "I didn't know what to do," she murmured. "I called, but the HOA said they had the right to do it." I swallowed down my anger. "You don't need to worry, Mom. I'll handle this." She gave me a small, knowing smile. "I know you will." I turned back to Karren, who was still standing outside, arms crossed like she was the victim in all this. "We'll expect payment by the end of the week," she said. "Otherwise, we'll be forced to escalate this matter." I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. "Oh, don't worry, Karren. I'll be handling this much sooner than that." She gave me a smug little nod and walked off, heels clicking against the pavement. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before my contact picked up. "Hey, it's Zane Lexington," I said. "Yeah, I'm ready to finalize the purchase, and I want the HOA president to be the first to know." Zane didn't waste a second. He left his mother's house, jaw set, mind already working through his next steps. Karren had no idea who she had just messed with. He wasn't some helpless homeowner cowering under the HOA's iron grip. He had resources, knowledge, and most importantly, a plan. As he drove across town, he made another call. The man on the other end picked up immediately. "Everything's in place?" Zane asked, keeping his voice steady. "Just waiting on your final word," the voice confirmed. "Consider it done. I want the paperwork filed today, and make sure the HOA board gets the notice first thing in the morning." He hung up, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Karren had made a serious miscalculation, and by the time she realized what was happening, it would be far too late for her to stop it. The following morning, Karren strutted into the Oakridge HOA office, completely unaware of the storm about to hit. She greeted the office assistant with a dismissive nod, then made her way to the conference room where the rest of the board was gathering. She loved these meetings. They were her kingdom, and she relished every opportunity to remind the other members who was truly in charge. She took her seat at the head of the table, tapping her nails against the polished wood. "Let's get started," she announced. First item, delinquent accounts, the Lexington case. Before she could finish, the office assistant rushed into the room, holding a thick envelope. "This just came in," she said, looking uncertain as she handed it to Karren. Karren frowned, tearing it open. As she scanned the contents, her expression darkened. This can't be right," she muttered. The board members exchanged glances. One of them, a balding man named Richard, leaned forward. "What is it?" Karren clenched her jaw. "It says here that the property ownership of Oakridge Estates has changed. The majority of the available residential lots, along with the undeveloped land, have been purchased by a private investor." Richard raised an eyebrow, and Karren's hands tightened around the paper. "And that investor is Zane Lexington." A stunned silence filled the room. Another board member, a woman named Linda, cleared her throat. "You mean the same Zane Lexington whose mother you just locked inside her home?" Karren's face twitched. "This has to be a mistake. There's no way he could have." She was cut off by the door swinging open. Zane stepped inside, dressed sharply in a dark suit, a confident glint in his eye. "Good morning, everyone," he said, placing a stack of documents on the table. "I see you've received my notice." Karren's mouth pressed into a thin line. "This is outrageous. You can't just—" "Oh, absolutely can," Zane interrupted, taking a seat across from her. "You see, thanks to your absurd policies, several homeowners were more than happy to sell their properties to me. And as of yesterday, I now own a significant portion of this neighborhood, including the land that the HOA relies on for its funding." Richard glanced at Karren, then back at Zane. "What exactly are you planning to do with all this ownership?" Zane leaned back, his expression unreadable. "For starters, I'm dissolving the HOA's authority over my properties. Your bylaws allow for that if a new majority owner opts out, which means you'll be losing a substantial chunk of your revenue." Karren's face paled. "You can't just—" "Oh, absolutely can," Zane repeated, his voice like steel. "And since I now own multiple properties on this street, I'll also be petitioning to have the HOA's governance reviewed by the city. Given your history of abusing authority, I doubt you'll be in power much longer." Linda, who had never been a fan of Karren's heavy-handed tactics, nodded slowly. "This could ruin us, Karren." Karren shot her a glare. "This is an attack on our community." Zane chuckled. "No, Karren, what you did to my mother was an attack. This is just consequences." She stood abruptly. "I won't allow it." Zane met her gaze, completely unfazed. "It's already done." The boardroom fell silent again. For the first time since she had taken charge of the HOA, Karren was completely powerless, and the realization was written all over her face. Zane stood, adjusting his cufflinks. "I'll be seeing you all very soon. In the meantime, I suggest you start preparing for some drastic changes." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Karren and the rest of the board to process the fact that their reign over Oakridge Estates was crumbling before their eyes. The HOA board sat in stunned silence long after Zane left the room. Karren's grip on the papers tightened as she scanned them again, willing them to change with sheer indignation. But they didn't. The signatures were real. The terms were final. Zane Lexington now owned a significant portion of Oakridge Estates, and there wasn't a thing she could do about it. The board members exchanged uncertain glances. Richard, who had always been one of Karren's staunchest supporters, leaned forward. His voice was measured, but there was a distinct edge to it. "This is a disaster," he said. "If Lexington follows through on pulling his properties out, we're going to lose a substantial amount of revenue. Our entire budget depends on those fees." Linda tapped her pen against the table. "And if he gets a city review involved, we all know the kind of things that'll come up in that audit. There have been questionable decisions made under your leadership, Karren." Karren's nails dug into the armrest of her chair. "He's bluffing," she snapped. "He's trying to scare us into backing off. We stand firm, and he'll realize he doesn't have the leverage he thinks he does." Richard shook his head. "You're not listening. He does have the leverage. He bought the properties legally. If he pulls out, we're finished. And if the city starts digging, we're worse than finished." Karren's lips pressed together so tightly they turned white. "We will not be bullied by some outsider who thinks he can waltz in and dismantle our authority." Linda exhaled, looking unimpressed. "Authority? Karren, you chained an elderly woman inside her house. That isn't authority. That's a lawsuit waiting to happen." Karren's eyes snapped to her. "Are you siding with him now?" Linda didn't flinch. "I'm siding with common sense. We need to address this before it spirals out of control." Karren stood abruptly. "Fine, you want me to handle it? I'll handle it." She stormed out of the room, leaving the rest of the board exchanging uneasy glances. Outside, Karren marched down the sidewalk, heels pounding against the pavement. She refused to let some nobody walk into her neighborhood and dictate terms. She had built Oakridge Estates into what it was. She had enforced order when no one else would. She wasn't about to sit back and let it all unravel because one man had deep pockets and a grudge. She reached Zane's mother's house and rang the doorbell, crossing her arms as she waited. The door opened, but it wasn't Kathleen standing there. It was Zane. He leaned casually against the frame, his expression unreadable. "It didn't take you long," he said. Karren stepped forward. "I want to discuss this situation rationally." Zane raised an eyebrow. "Rationally? You mean unlike the way you handled my mother's so-called late fees?" Karren's fingers twitched, but she forced a tight smile. "I admit things may have gotten a bit heated, but we both know that an HOA functions on structure. If you start pulling houses out, you'll disrupt that structure. It won't just hurt us, it will hurt the community." Zane didn't move. "You mean it'll hurt your power?" Karren's smile faltered. "You think you've won something here, but what you're doing is reckless. You don't understand what it takes to keep a neighborhood functioning properly." Zane gave a short laugh. "Oh, I understand perfectly. Understand that a neighborhood is meant to serve the people who live in it, not a power-hungry board that fines people into submission. And understand that you've been using your position for personal gain." Karren stiffened. "That's a baseless accusation." Zane tilted his head. "Is it? Because I've been doing my homework. Homeowners who question your policies suddenly find themselves buried in violations. Residents who don't bend to your will mysteriously get denied permits for renovations. And then, of course, there's the little matter of the contractor fees." Karren's skin went rigid. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Zane pulled out his phone, tapped a few buttons, then turned the screen toward her. "This says otherwise. Multiple payments made to a construction firm owned by your cousin, all approved under your authority with no competing bids. That's fraud, Karren, and have the receipts." Karren's throat tightened. "You have no proof." Zane cut her off. "I have every piece of proof I need, and I'm not the only one who has it now." Karren's stomach dropped. Zane put his phone away. "I sent copies to the city council this morning and to the state HOA oversight board. Imagine you'll be getting some very interesting calls in the near future." Karren's nails dug into her palms. "You can't do this." Zane's expression hardened. "I already did." A long silence stretched between them. Karren's mind raced for a way out, but every possible escape closed in around her. Zane's voice was calm but final. "You have two options. You can resign quietly and maybe walk away with some dignity intact, or you can fight and watch everything come crashing down on top of you." Karren's breath came short and shallow. She had spent years building her influence, making sure she was untouchable. And now, in the span of 24 hours, it was all crumbling. Zane took a step back. I'll give you until the end of the day to make your decision." He didn't wait for a response. He simply closed the door, leaving Karren standing on the porch, staring blankly at the wood in front of her. For the first time in her reign over Oakridge Estates, she was out of moves. Karren stood on the porch, her hands shaking slightly as she stared at the closed door. The weight of Zane's ultimatum pressed down on her, but she refused to accept defeat. There had to be a way out of this. She turned sharply and stalked back toward her car, her mind scrambling for a solution. The HOA board was weak, spineless. They would crumble the moment pressure mounted, but she had survived worse. She would not let some outsider destroy everything she had built. Back at the HOA office, Richard and Linda were still seated at the conference table when she stormed in. Richard glanced up, his expression wary. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he muttered. Karren tossed the documents onto the table and glared at them. "Lexington thinks he's one, he's bluffing." Linda folded her arms. He didn't look like he was bluffing when he walked in here with legal documents and proof of fraud. Karren ignored her. "We need to act fast. If we can counter him before the city gets involved, we might be able to stop him." Richard frowned. "And how do you propose we do that? He owns the properties. We can't override legal ownership." Karren's mind raced. There had to be a loophole, a clause in the bylaws that gave them an edge. She grabbed a thick binder from the shelf and flipped through the pages, scanning for anything useful. Linda sighed. "You're grasping at straws, Karren. The only way out of this is damage control. If we resign quietly, we might avoid legal repercussions." Karren shot her a sharp look. "You're suggesting we just roll over and let him take everything? No, that's not happening." Richard rubbed his temples. "You're not listening. If the city gets involved, they'll dig into everything. The financials, the contractor deals, the fines. If Lexington's evidence holds up, this whole organization could collapse." Karren's grip on the binder tightened. She refused to let years of control slip through her fingers. Linda leaned forward. "You need to think about yourself, Karren. If you fight this, you might be facing real legal consequences." Karren slammed the binder shut. "I don't need your advice. I need solutions." Richard exhaled slowly. "There aren't any, not this time." She clenched her jaw, refusing to accept it, but deep down, she knew they were right. Lexington had backed her into a corner, and there was no easy way out. For the first time in years, Karren felt something she hadn't experienced in a long-time fear. Meanwhile, Zane sat in his mother's living room, sipping a cup of coffee while Kathleen watched him with an amused smile. "You always did have a way of handling problems," she said, stirring her tea. Zane chuckled. "I learned from the best." She shook her head. "I still don't understand how you managed to pull this off so quickly." He set his cup down. "Simple. Had been looking for real estate investments anyway, and when I saw how this HOA was running things, I knew I had to act fast. A few phone calls, some well-timed offers, and here we are." Kathleen sighed. "I just hope it makes a difference for the people who live here." Zane nodded. "It will. Once Karren is out, we'll restructure everything. No more ridiculous fines, no more harassment." She smiled softly. "You always did fight for the little guy." Zane's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and smirked. "And speaking of fighting, it looks like the city just scheduled a meeting with the HOA board." Kathleen chuckled. "I almost feel bad for them, almost." Zane stood. "Time to finish this." Karren sat at the head of the conference table, her fingers tapping against the polished surface. The rest of the board members sat stiffly, tension thick in the air. The door opened, and a middle-aged man in a crisp suit stepped inside, followed by two other officials. He set a folder down and took a seat, flipping through the pages with an air of practiced authority. "Karren Sterling," he began, without looking up. You are aware of the complaints filed against the Oakridge HOA. Karren forced a tight smile. There have been some misunderstandings, but nothing that can't be resolved internally. The official finally looked at her, his gaze sharp. Misunderstandings? From what I've reviewed, this HOA has issued excessive fines, misallocated funds, and engaged in questionable contracting practices. That is not a misunderstanding. Linda shifted in her chair, visibly uncomfortable. Richard kept his gaze fixed on the table. The official continued. Additionally, we received evidence of an incident involving the unlawful imprisonment of a resident. Care to explain? Karren's throat tightened. That was an enforcement action based on delinquent fees. The property was. The official held up a hand. Let me stop you right there. You chained an elderly woman inside her own home. That is not enforcement. That is illegal. A heavy silence settled over the room. The second official, a woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. Given the severity of these allegations, the city is formally launching an investigation. Effective immediately, all HOA operations are suspended pending review. Linda let out a breath of relief. Richard glanced at Karren, waiting for her response. Karren swallowed hard. You can't just shut us down. The first official frowned. We absolutely can, and if further violations are found, you will be held personally accountable. Karren's world tilted. Everything she had built was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The door opened again, and Zane walked in, hands in his pockets, watching the room with quiet amusement. Perfect timing, he said. I assume you've gone over everything. The official nodded. We have, and I believe you'll be pleased with the outcome. Zane turned to Karren. Told you this would end one of two ways. She glared at him, but there was no fire left in her eyes. Zane leaned down slightly. You should have just left my mother alone. Karren's shoulders slumped, defeat washing over her. This was the end. Zane straightened. I'll be taking over from here. Karren sat frozen in her chair, her usually sharp, commanding presence now reduced to stunned silence. The weight of the official's words was sinking in, crushing the last remnants of control she thought she had. The rest of the board sat stiffly, their expressions ranging from grim acceptance to barely concealed relief. Zane remained standing, his gaze flicking between the officials and Karren. There was no gloating in his expression, no need for unnecessary words. The facts spoke for themselves, and Karren knew she had lost. The lead official looked around the room, his tone firm. He wasn't interested in negotiations. He was here to enforce consequences. Given the evidence we've reviewed, an independent audit of the HOA's financial practices will begin immediately. Pending the outcome, legal action may be taken against those responsible for fraudulent activity. Karren's fingers twitched against the table. Her mind was racing, searching for some way to salvage the situation, but every route led back to the same inescapable conclusion. The second official, the sharp-eyed woman, added, additionally, the city will be overturning any recent enforcement actions that violated homeowner rights. This includes unlawful property seizures, fabricated fines, and any other punitive measures taken without due process. Zane crossed his arms, and assumed the homeowners affected will be compensated. The lead official nodded. That will be determined based on the findings of the audit, but yes, restitution is likely. Linda exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Richard avoided looking at Karren. The other board members, who had remained silent until now, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Karren finally found her voice, though it was weaker than she wanted. This HOA has existed for decades. One man can't just walk in and dismantle it overnight. Zane's expression didn't change. Not overnight, just faster than you expected. She clenched her jaw, a flash of anger breaking through the shock. You think this will make the neighborhood better? You're tearing down the structure that holds it together. Without regulations, this place will fall apart. Zane shook his head. Regulations aren't the problem. Corruption is, and I'm not tearing anything down, I'm rebuilding it. The difference is, this time, the homeowners will actually have a say in how their neighborhood is run. Karren opened her mouth to argue, but the officials stood, signaling the discussion was over. The lead official gathered his papers. The city will be in touch. In the meantime, all enforcement actions by this HOA are suspended. I suggest you prepare for the investigation. Without waiting for a response, the officials exited the room. Zane turned to the remaining board members. His tone was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. For those of you who actually care about this community, you'll have a chance to be part of the new structure. But it won't look anything like what Karren built. Linda met his gaze and gave a small nod. Richard hesitated before standing. I think we all know where this is heading, he muttered. I'm out. One by one, the other board members followed, leaving Karren alone at the table. Zane didn't move. He simply watched as she sat there, staring at nothing, the reality of her downfall settling in. You should probably start packing up your office, he said, his voice even. I doubt you'll be needing it much longer. For the first time in years, Karren had nothing to say. Zane turned and walked out, shutting the door behind him. The news spread through Oakridge Estates like wildfire. By the end of the day, residents were talking in hushed murmurs, exchanging glances filled with cautious hope. By the next morning, hope had turned into something stronger. Zane had wasted no time. He called a meeting in the neighborhood park, inviting every homeowner to attend. This wasn't just about taking down the HOA, it was about building something better. The turnout was larger than expected. Dozens of homeowners gathered, some wary, some eager, all curious about what came next. Zane stood in front of the crowd, hands in his pockets, taking a moment before speaking. Some of you know me. Some of you have probably only heard my name in the last 24 hours. But what matters is that we're all here for the same reason, because we're tired of being controlled by a system that doesn't serve us. A few heads nodded, others murmured in agreement. He continued, the HOA as it stands now is done. The city is investigating, and from what I've seen, the corruption runs deep. But instead of just waiting for them to clean up the mess, I want to talk about what comes next. A man in the crowd spoke up. Are you saying we won't have an HOA at all? Zane shook his head. Not necessarily, but if we do, it won't be anything like what we had before. No more power-hungry leadership, no more ridiculous fines, no more harassment. A woman near the front crossed her arms. And what makes you different? You just bought up half the neighborhood. How do we know you won't turn into the same thing? Zane met her gaze. Because I don't want control. I want fairness, and I don't make decisions alone. That's why I'm proposing a homeowners council one where every resident gets a vote on major decisions. No single person should have the power Karren had. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. An older man in the back raised a hand. And what about the fines? Some of us have been drowning in them for years. Zane nodded. Any fines issued under Karren's leadership that didn't have a legitimate legal basis will be overturned. I've already started working with a lawyer to make sure of it. The energy in the crowd shifted. People who had been skeptical were now leaning in, listening intently. Linda stepped forward. I was on the board under Karren, and I'll be the first to admit I didn't do enough to stop what was happening, but I want to be part of fixing it. Several others nodded, stepping up to volunteer. Zane smiled, then let's get to work. In that moment, the neighborhood transformed. It wasn't about fear anymore. It wasn't about control. It was about rebuilding trust, about taking back their community. And as for Karren, by the end of the week, she had cleared out her office. She didn't say goodbye, she didn't fight back. She simply disappeared, her influence over Oakridge Estates nothing more than a bitter memory. Justice had been served, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood was finally free. The crowd lingered long after the meeting ended, neighbors gathering in clusters, talking in ways they hadn't in years. With Karren's grip finally broken, there was an energy in the air, a cautious hope that things could finally be different. Zane watched from the edge of the park, arms folded as he listened to the conversations around him. People were already discussing improvements, tossing around ideas for what a fair and functional system could look like. The fear that had ruled Oakridge Estates was gone, replaced with something far more powerful: unity. Linda approached, her expression unreadable. She had been quiet through most of the meeting, but now she studied him as if weighing something carefully. "You really aren't sticking around to run things, are you?" she asked. Zane shook his head. "That was never the plan. I stepped in to stop the corruption, not to replace it. The homeowners should be the ones deciding what happens next, not me." She nodded slowly. "You know, for a guy who just took over half the neighborhood, you don't act like someone hungry for control." He chuckled. "I prefer to keep my fights short and decisive." Karren made the mistake of thinking she was untouchable. She never considered that someone could outmaneuver her. Linda exhaled, glancing toward the people still chatting in small groups. She ruled through intimidation. Everyone was too afraid to challenge her, even when we knew she was crossing lines. Zane studied her. "So why didn't you?" She hesitated before answering. "Because I thought I could fix things from the inside. Thought if I stayed on the board, I'd have enough influence to course correct her worst decisions. But the deeper I got, the more I realized she didn't leave room for dissent. The only way to stop her was to tear the whole thing down." Zane considered that for a moment before nodding. "Then consider this your fresh start. You can actually be part of something good this time." Linda's lips pressed together, then she extended a hand. "I'll do what I can to make sure this place doesn't fall into another power trap." Zane shook her hand. "Good, because I'm counting on people like you to keep things fair." She gave him a single nod, then walked off to join a group of homeowners discussing the next steps. Zane turned to find his mother standing nearby, watching him with a knowing expression. She had been quiet through most of the meeting, but now, as the last of the stragglers began to head home, she finally spoke. "You did what you came to do," she said, "so what happens now?" He exhaled, glancing at the street lined with houses, the ones he had bought, the ones he had helped free. Now I step back and let them build something better." Kathleen tilted her head. "And you just walk away." He smiled slightly. "Not walk away, just move on. I didn't do all this to stay in control. I did it so you and everyone else here could live without fear." She gave him a long look. "You really are your father's son." Zane's chest tightened at that, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to. By the end of the week, the transition was in full swing. With the HOA dismantled, a temporary council had stepped in to oversee the restructuring. Linda had taken a leadership role, working with a team of residents to draft a fair system that protected homeowners without suffocating them under excessive rules. Karren, meanwhile, had disappeared from public view. Her office had been emptied out, her reign over Oakridge Estates reduced to nothing more than a bitter memory. Rumors swirled about legal trouble on the horizon, but no one seemed particularly concerned about her fate. She had wielded power like a weapon for years, and now that power was completely gone. Zane, true to his word, had begun the process of transferring ownership of several properties back to individual residents. Those who had been forced to sell under Karren's oppressive rule were given the first opportunity to reclaim their homes, this time without the looming threat of fabricated violations and endless fines. On the last evening before he planned to leave town, Zane stood outside his mother's house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Kathleen stepped out onto the porch, wrapping a light cardigan around her shoulders as she joined him. "You sure you don't want to stick around and see how it all turns out?" she asked. Zane shook his head. "They've got it handled. Linda and the others will make sure things stay on the right track." She studied him for a moment. "You never could sit still for long." He chuckled. "Guess take after you more than I thought." A comfortable silence settled between them before Kathleen spoke again. "You're a good man, Zane, and I know your father would be proud of what you did here." He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "I hope so." She squeezed his arm gently, then stepped back inside, leaving him alone with his thoughts. As the last light of day faded, Zane took one final look around the neighborhood. The place felt different now, lighter, freer. People weren't afraid to step outside their doors, to talk to their neighbors without the ever-present threat of the HOA looming over them. It was enough. With a final exhale, Zane turned and walked toward his car, ready for whatever came next.